book, the chapter that describes the legalities of the marriage between Boaz and Ruth. And we don't waste any time. Just to review very quickly, chapter 1 tells the story of Elimelech and his family moving from Judea, from Beit Lechem to Moab. His son's married to a Moabite woman. They die. All the males died. Elimelech has 2 sons. Naomi tries to convince her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab. She's poor now. She has nothing back in Beit Lechem to give them. There's no one they can marry. They head back to Beit Lechem. Chapter 1. Chapter 2 describes how they're so poor. So Ruth goes to collect the gifts of produce, the leket, the ears of grain that fall during the harvest, and she ends up in the field of Boaz, who's the relative, and Boaz treats her with dignity. And that's the conclusion of chapter 2, is the conclusion of the harvest season. Then we get to chapter 3. Chapter 3, Naomi tells Ruth, we have to worry about what's going to be with the marriage. You have to find rest. You have to find a husband. So they have Boaz. It's his responsibility to, he's a goel, he's a relative. He has to marry the widow of his relatives. So why don't you go to him at night? And we read that story. And again, part of the story of why she has to go at night and it can't be formal and it can't be in the open is because they thought that it is maybe a moral problem to consummate this marriage because she was a Moabite woman. And the end of the story is that Boaz tells her, I would be happy to marry you because of your kindness, but there's a closer relative. So he gives her food. He says, go home. She comes to her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law says, don't worry, Boaz will take care of this matter today. And chapter 4 is the next morning. So Boaz went up to the gate. I'm reading verse 1. And Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz had spoken was passing. And he said, turn aside, sit down here, so-and-so. And he turned aside and sat down. So, first of all, he refers to him kinsman, but in the Torah we discussed this yesterday, the word is goel, the redeemer. And what's interesting is that he doesn't say the Torah, and we're going to mention this goel, we're going to mention this relative who's closer relative than Boaz is. We're going to mention him many times, and we're going to mention him many times, but it doesn't say his name. Why doesn't it say his name? In fact, we call him Ploni Almoni. So whatever Ploni Almoni means, Ploni is like saying John Doe. Even in modern Hebrew, when you want to say somebody, you say Ploni. So we're not even saying his name. Why aren't we saying his name? Now it happens to be we know exactly who he was. In other words, we know who his brothers. We know he was Elimelech's brother, and he was Elimelech's brother, and he's closer to Naomi than Boaz, who's Elimelech's nephew. That makes sense? Yes. So he's Naomi's brother-in-law, and Boaz is Naomi's nephew, Elimelech's nephew. I think that's what that means. In any case, he's close, so we don't say his name. Why don't we say his name? So part of this may be that if you look at the Levirate marriage, what's at stake here is who is going to keep the name of the deceased family alive. So we have Elimelech passed away, Machlon and Kilion, the 2 sons of Elimelech died. And when the Torah talks about the Levirate marriage, the Torah says that the reason why you have to do it is to preserve a name for your brother. So it keeps emphasizing that the kindness that you do to the deceased is by marrying the widow and having children, you keep the name alive. Now, this person doesn't want to keep the name alive, right? We'll see later why he doesn't want to. But in any case, he doesn't want to keep the name alive. So it's possible that that's why his name is not mentioned, because it's measure for measure. If you don't want to help other people preserve their name, there's no reason that the book of Ruth will go out of its way to preserve your own name. And therefore, even though everybody in the story is named, this person, we talk about him many times in this chapter, we refer to him the Goel, the Redeemer, we refer to him, in other words, potential Redeemer, we refer to him as Ploni, and he's just a John Doe, he's just somebody, we're not sure who he is. Now, what exactly was, so that's one idea. There's more to talk about, but that's one idea. Another way, an interesting theory is as follows. An interesting theory is when the Torah doesn't say a name, it's basically keeping the person anonymous. What we're saying is this person represents the community. In other words, there's no reason to say his name was Yankel, meaning to say, and then you'll attribute what he did because his Yankel, his upbringing, his family. What we're trying to say is he's anonymous. He's just a member of the community. Most people in his position will act the same. And that's here to highlight how Boaz is different, how Boaz is willing to marry Ruth. He is actually different and more kind, not only than it happened to be the other relative, the closer relative, but also than the society as a whole. So that could be, and also could be the reason why we keep his name anonymous, to say it's not that he's anything unusual. The fact that he didn't want to marry her is actually, he's just a member of the public. In other words, most people in that society will act that same way. So that also can be a reason of why the Megillah, the scroll, does not mention his name at all. There's another few interpretations about his name, and that will get interesting. Interesting is, so what does Ploni mean? We're not sure what Ploni means. Ploni could come from the word, Ploni is, like you say today, when you want to say in Hebrew, even in modern Hebrew, is just a person, John Doe, you say Ploni. So Ploni means just a person. Now, what does the word mean? So it could be the word comes from the word Pele. Pele means a wonder. Wonder means something you don't understand. So it's possible if you can't name something, you say it's a wonder. So if you can't name this person, they have a name, Pele, Ploni, which is like Pele, which is a person, a wondrous person. Wondrous not in the same that he's extraordinary, but wondrous in the same that you can't define it, you can't classify it, you don't know who he is. So that's Ploni. Now Almoni gets interesting. Almoni is the second name, John Doe. Who's the Doe, right? What's the last name? Almoni. So Almoni comes from the word Elaim, he's silent. Silent means he can't speak. So here, the Talmud says as follows. The Talmud says that he can't speak, meaning he's ignorant. What does it mean he's ignorant? He doesn't know the law that Boaz knows. He doesn't know that you're allowed to marry a Moabite woman. And even though Boaz tries to convince him that you're allowed to, he still doesn't know it. So in other words, it's trying to say his ignorance. It's trying to say that the fact that he doesn't marry Ruth is not because there's a problem with marrying Ruth, but it's a problem with his own level of knowledge and acceptance of the Torah. So that could be another reason why his name is not mentioned. Like I said, Rashi mentions that the reason why his name is not mentioned is simply a punishment. He didn't want to redeem, so therefore we don't mention his name. Okay, so that's verse 1. Verse 2 is fascinating. So Boaz comes to the gate. What's the gate? The gate is Greenwich Avenue. The gate is where all the people hang out for commerce. The gate is where the court sits at the gate. Boaz goes straight to the gate, right? Contrast that. When they thought that their marriage is illegitimate, Naomi tells Ruth to go to Boaz at night where nobody could see. Boaz takes the opposite approach. Boaz wants complete transparency. Not only does he wait for the morning and call a couple of people together, but he goes straight for the gate. And the gate is where the court will sit. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here, and they sat down. Oh, I missed a verse. In verse 1, it happens to be, and Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz had spoken was passing. So a fascinating thing happened. Boaz shows up in the market. He wants the court to summons this closer relative, but he doesn't have to do that because even before that, Hashem arranged, behold means it's a surprise. The Goel, the closer relative, showed up. So Boaz shows up to the court, shows up to the town square, shows up to the gates, and then he just sees that again, just like in the beginning of the story, we had that Ruth happened to go to a field and it happened to be the field of Boaz. Here too, Boaz comes to the gate, and it happens to be that the Goel, the closer relative, was there. So now he takes 10 men, verse 2, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here, and they sat down. Why does he need 10 men? Again, he's going to start talking to the Goel and say, do you want to redeem, do you want to marry Ruth? And he has this whole thing with the field. We'll get to that in a minute. But he's got this whole transaction going on. He's got this whole business proposal. Why does he need 10 men? So the Talmud offers two interpretations, both fascinating. Number one is, it's very appropriate because Menachem and Darren got married last night. For those of us who are on the call, you can see it. But for a man, you need 10 people for a minyan. For the Sheva Brachas, the Birchas Chasan, and the blessing of the bride and groom at the chuppah, you need 10 men. How do you know that from? The Gemara says, the Talmud says, The reason why you know you need 10 men at a chuppah, or 10 people at a chuppah, is you get it from this verse. So the reason why Boaz collected 10 people is because he was planning on the marriage. He wasn't sitting and waiting a few years. As soon as this Goel would say if he doesn't want to marry, he doesn't want to marry. But in any case, we need 10 people for the marriage. That's one approach. There's another approach, and I'll tell you why we need a second approach. The reason why we need a second approach is because if it's just about having 10 people present for the wedding, then you don't need elders, right? It says he took 10 men of the elders of the city. Who needs the elders? We don't need any elders. Anybody could participate in the wedding. So here comes the second interpretation of the Talmud, and this is fascinating. He needs 10 people because he needs the court to give a ruling. What's the ruling? That you're allowed to marry a Moabite woman. Because again, we discussed this in the first lesson, right in the beginning. We discussed that the Torah says, it says it in the singular male form. A Moabite person and a Moabite male and an Ammonite male cannot join the community. So the Talmud says, we got it from Boaz, that it applies specifically to a Moabite male, not a female. And a Moabite female could marry into the people. And there was this big debate because it's not clear, because not always when the Torah says singular does the Torah refer specifically to male, not female. Not when it says singular male, other places it includes the women as well. So the discussion goes back and forth, and ultimately there's a few reasons. One reason is because the Torah itself gives the reason. The reason is because the Moabites and the Ammonites did not greet the Jewish people, with bread and water when they were coming into Israel. In fact, they did not allow them to pass through their land. So the Talmud says that that's the reason. Then the reason it only applies to men, because the reason only applies to the males, because only the men were the people who then in that society could decide who to go to war with and who to grant passage to. So because the Torah gives the reason, that's why now we can look at the reason and see the reason was not applicable. So that's the law that Boaz understands. But Boaz doesn't know it. It's not well known. Not only is it not well known here, later on we'll see that generations later, in the time of King David, a few generations later, it was also unknown. It wasn't widely known. And therefore, many people said that David was an illegitimate king. But that's another story. So in other words, it was not well known. So why is Boaz gathering 10 elders of the city? So he wants the court, he wants to say it in front of the court, he wants people to hear about it, and he wants the court to agree. Now, it's very interesting. Boaz, you can't give a ruling if you're biased, if you're going to benefit from it. So Boaz cannot say, oh, I have a tradition, I derive that you're allowed to marry a Moabite woman, and by the way, I'm going to marry a Moabite woman. Doesn't work that way, right? You can't rule about something that pertains to yourself. You have to, what's the word? You have to, what is the word when the judge is not allowed to try the case because they have a connection?
Recuse yourself.
You have to recuse yourself. Thank you. So Boaz has to recuse himself. He has no business ruling about something that is specifically relevant to his own story. In other words, he wants to marry her, so he says, "Oh, by the way," he pulled it out of his hat. Nobody ever heard of it, but he's got this new idea that it applies specifically to a Moabite man, not a woman. So what's interesting here is, when does Boaz pull this out of his hat? Before he offers the deal to the Redeemer. In other words, he's trying to convince the closer relative to marry Ruth. So it's not about him. It's about the relative. So he's allowed to talk about somebody else. Later, it happens to be that the relative rejects the deal. So then Boaz goes ahead and marries her. But that law has already been established about somebody else. Because it's established about somebody else, therefore it's legitimate. So that's just interesting with verse number 2, that he puts 10 elders, because it's not just him talking to the closer relative saying, do you want to marry Boaz? Do you want to marry Ruth? It's a much bigger problem. In other words, you have a more important task, and that is to establish the law that was different than what was widely known at the time. Okay, So now the next couple of verses are interesting. I'm going to tell you what happens first outside, a summary, and then maybe we'll read it inside, and then we'll see what's taking place over here. So Boaz is a good businessman. First, he wants to sell, but he doesn't give all the information at first. He wants it to be more appealing. So here's the story. He tells this redeemer, look, your relative, Naomi, has a piece of a field because she inherits her husband's land. She wants to sell. There's a mitzvah in the Torah that even if you sell your land, the relative should buy it. The relative could buy it back from the buyer because we want to keep the field in the family. So theoretically, in the time of the Jubilee, when the Jubilee applied, when all the Jews were living in Israel, if I sell a land because I'm poor and I sell it to somebody outside of my family, somebody else can then someone else from my family could come in and redeem the field, so to speak, meaning pay the buyer what the buyer paid, and the buyer would then leave the field and give the field back to the relative. So that's called geula. In the Torah, it's called redemption. You're redeeming the field. You're putting it back where it belongs. It belongs in the hand of the family. So Boaz comes to the relative, to the closer relative, and he says, look, Naomi wants to sell her field. You're the closest redeemer. Would you want to buy the field? And what Jew doesn't want to buy real estate? He says, of course, I want to buy the field. And here comes the catch. Okay? First he gets the yes. He's a good salesman. First he gets the yes, and then he says the catch. He says, oh, the problem with the field is as follows. Naomi only owns 50% of the field. The other 50% belongs to Ruth. So they're only going to sell, they're not going to sell half the land. So if you want to buy Naomi's half, you also have to buy Ruth's half. But how do you buy Ruth's half? The way you buy Ruth's half is you marry her. If you marry her, you get her half as well, plus you'll get Naomi's half. And the guy says, nope, I'm not interested. So even though he was so eager to buy the field, and he's very eager to buy the field, as we will see, but he's not eager at all to marry. He doesn't want to marry. He doesn't want to marry Boaz. He doesn't want to marry Ruth. And he says that what he says is okay. So he says I don't want to do it, and we'll see why he doesn't want to do it. And I'm just going to read these verses, and we'll point this out as we go. So I'm going to read from verse 3 to verse 6. Not too much. So, and he said to the near kinsman, Boaz says to the closer redeemer, to the relative, he says, Naomi, who has returned from the field of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to her brother, to Elimelech. To our brother, to Elimelech. And I said, I will let you know, saying, buy it in the presence of those who sit here and before the elders of the people. If you will redeem, redeem. And if you will not redeem, tell me, and I will know, for there is no one besides you to redeem, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem. So he says, do you want to redeem the field? Because if not, you're the closest relative. If not, I'm the next guy in line, says Boaz. And if you don't redeem it, then I'll redeem it. So what does the guy say? What does the relative say? Sure, you have a deal. You have an option to get a good piece of land in Beit Lechem, not too far from Jerusalem. It's a good deal. He says, I'm going to redeem it. Now, here's the catch. Like I said, verse 5, Boaz brings up the other point here. He says, and Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, remember, till now we didn't mention Ruth. He just said, buy the field of Naomi. But now he says, oh, there's another partner. If you want to buy the field from Naomi and from Ruth, the wife of the deceased, you have bought it to preserve the name of this deceased on his heritage. You want to buy the field, you have to also preserve the name. And everybody knows what preserve the name means because they know the Torah. And in the Torah, it's unequivocal. Preserving the name is through levirate marriage. So he says, if you want to redeem the field, you got to get the whole field. You also have to take the part of Ruth. And the way you get the part of Ruth is if you're willing to reestablish the name of the deceased, meaning marry the widow of the deceased, meaning marry Ruth. What does he say? Vayomer HaGoel, the near kinsman said, who before he said, yeah, I want to redeem. Now he says, I can't do it. I cannot redeem it to myself, lest I mar my heritage. You redeem my redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. I don't want to destroy my own heritage. It's not clear what he means, but that's what he says. He says, I can't do it because I'm going to destroy my heritage. What's so bad with marrying Ruth? Why are you going to destroy your heritage? So Rashi says, my lineage. She says heritage. Rashi says, I'm reading Rashi now. Lest I mar my heritage, my offspring. Like, behold, the heritage of the Lord is sons. To give my offsprings a stigma. As it is said, an Ammonite and Moabite shall not enter the congregation of the Lord, but he erred by not interpreting it as an Ammonite, but not Ammonitis. In other words, he basically doesn't buy, even though Boaz is a distinguished man, and the court is there, and the court says you're allowed to marry a Moabite woman. He does not feel that the people are going to accept it, and therefore he says, I don't need this for my children. I don't need to harm my own reputation and the reputation of my children. So once again, he is concerned with his own heritage, with his own interests. And then again, contrasts that to Boaz, who now is going to go and marry Ruth, because he's putting the kindness to Ruth before popular opinion. So this is the second time in the story where somebody does the kind act, and it's contrasted by first somebody else rejecting the kind act. So the first scene was the scene of Ruth and Orpah, both daughters-in-law, and they both try to do kindness with Naomi. They want to go with her, and Naomi says, don't come. And then Orpah leaves, and the fact that Orpah leaves highlights that Ruth stays, highlights Ruth's kindness. And in this part of the story, it's the same idea. The fact that the Goel, the Redeemer, is very happy to buy a field, but would not even consider marrying Ruth, even though maybe it's permitted according to what the court is saying at this point. But he's afraid that popular opinion doesn't accept it. He's afraid that people are going to talk about it and it's not popular. So he does not want to marry Ruth, do the kindness to the family, and instead he's concerned with his own nachala, with his own heritage. That highlights what the kindness of Boaz, and again, that's really the theme of the story. The theme of the story is the kindness of Boaz and Ruth, who then established the monarchy. Ultimately, the monarchy descends from them. So now we have verse 7 and 8 is just a legal transaction. In those days, if you have to make a transaction, you have to make a formal act of acquisition, and you have to take an item. You would lift the item, and that would sort of symbolize the formal act of acquisition. And you do it with a garment. Today, you do it also sometimes if you go to an engagement party, you'll see that the bride and groom each lift up a piece of material, and that represents that they commit, because you have to have a commitment to make you have to make a formal act of acquisition to make the commitment binding. And here they do it with the shoe. I'm reading verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redemption and exchange. To confirm anything, one would remove his shoe and give it to this fellow. And this was the attestation in Israel. This was te'udah. This was the evidence. This was attestation. And that's what the Redeemer tells Boaz. He says, buy it for yourself. And he removed his shoe. And Boaz said to the elders and to the entire people, you are witnesses today that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was his chilons and machlons from Naomi. And also, verse 10, and also Ruth the Moabitess, Machlon's wife, have I acquired for myself for a wife, to preserve the name of the deceased and his heritage, so that the name of the deceased not be obliterated from his brethren and from the gate of his place you are witness today. So Boaz is basically mentioning all the verses in the Torah that talk about you marry Ruth, you keep the family's name alive. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Now comes one of the most poetic verses in the book, and there's so much commentary here. I'll do my best to convey at least a little bit of it. So, remember, this is a public event. He makes the event. He tells everybody, I'm buying the field. I'm also marrying Ruth. So everybody starts blessing them. You have Jews. As soon as you say someone's getting engaged, all of a sudden all the bubbies come, and everyone starts blessing the bride and groom. And it started, at least, we know it goes back at least to the book of Ruth. Here we go. And all the people who were at the gate of the elders replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house, meaning Ruth, like Rachel and like Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel and prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. So they say God should bless the woman coming into your house. Let them be like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel. Now, Ruth also is going to build, not the house of Israel, but Ruth builds the house of the monarch. She builds the kingdom of David. But they mention Rachel and Leah, nobody else. They don't mention Sarah, they don't mention Rebecca. They say Rachel and Leah. That's an interesting point. Then they continue. And may your house be like the house of Peretz, whom Tamar bore to Judah, with the seed that the Lord will give you from this maiden. Now they go back to the family. Rachel and Leah built the entire house, the entire people of Israel. But then when you had the next generation, was Peretz was the son of Judah, who born to Judah and Tamar. And we know that story. The story is the similar story. I think I've mentioned in the past. But Tamar is daughter-in-law of Judah. Two of Judah's sons die. The daughter-in-law, again, is waiting for someone else in the family to marry her. Then she sees no one's going to marry her, so she presents herself as a harlot. And Judah has relations with her, and Judah thinks she's a harlot. Judah wants her to be killed. When he finds out that she's pregnant, Judah thinks she's a harlot, and then later when he finds out that his daughter-in-law, who's sort of betrothed to someone in the family, not no one specific, but she has to marry someone from the family. She hears that she's pregnant. He declares that she's liable for death. And then she pulls out the signs that Judah gave her for payment. And she says, the father of this child is the owner of these signs. And Judah says, it was me. And they have twins at the end. And that's Peretz. And Peretz is, again, the ancestor of King David, an ancestor of Boaz, an ancestor of many prominent people in that lineage. So they bless him. They bless Boaz, and they say, your wife, the woman coming into your house, shall be like Rachel and Leah, and your house shall be like the house of Peretz. So why specifically these people? That's what we're going to discuss now. In the meantime, if anybody wants to make any comments, go right ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, Naomi had said yesterday that it's going to be resolved tomorrow. Now you're mentioning this thing with that she had land and he was going to make this deal with the land. Had there been a discussion between Naomi and Boaz about the fact that there was this land? And so she kind of knew that he was going to bring that up, that there was this land.
So that's a good question. We don't know exactly what she knew. See, the verse says as follows. The verse says, it's a strange verse. Verse 3 in chapter 4 says, and he said to the Goel, to the near kinsman, to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the field of Moab, is selling the portion of the field. Now, this is a very nice story, but except it doesn't say it in the Hebrew. Selling is present. In the Hebrew, it says machra, she sold. Okay? So it could be read that, if you read it simply, it means Naomi sold the field, and now if you're the Redeemer, you have to buy it back. Do you want to buy it back? Remember, because we said in biblical times, you could buy back the field that Naomi sold. So that's one possibility. One possibility is Naomi sold the land, and Boaz, so you don't have to buy back the land. But Boaz, in order to make this deal more appealing to the Redeemer, he says, look, you want to buy back the land? The guy says, yes. He says, oh, would you marry them as well? He says, no. That's one approach. But there's one more approach, and based on both these approaches, I'm going to respond to your question. The other approach is the reason why it says in past tense. In the Hebrew, it says that Naomi sold. It doesn't say she is selling. It says in the Hebrew, she sold. Sold means she put it up for sale. Doesn't mean she sold it. It means it's up for sale. And therefore, from Naomi's perspective, Naomi doesn't necessarily know what Boaz is going to do with this information. Naomi never spoke to Boaz. But Boaz knows that there's a for sale sign, that Naomi put it up for sale. Now, Boaz himself is the one that's connecting these two, because when Boaz looks at this scenario, remember the Torah. There's two ways you can preserve the name. One is land, and one is children. Right? In the Torah portion of Bahar, we read it 3 weeks ago. We read it 2 weeks ago. We keep losing track of time because of Corona. But I think it was 2 weeks ago, we read Bahar. These are the two things that the relative can do. The relative can marry the name of the deceased brother. That's one form of kindness. But the Torah uses that same term of Goel, of Redeemer, to buy back the field. So in other words, keep the land. So Boaz himself is the one combining this. I'm not sure Naomi combined the two. For Naomi, it could have been two separate stories. I don't know if that clarifies or just complicates one or the other.
Okay, I'll accept it.
I had a question.
Yes.
Did Boaz have any children or wives?
Boaz probably had children and a wife. He was an old man at the time. The answer is yes. Some people say that one of the reasons why the Goel said, the Redeemer says, I don't want to marry Ruth is because one second, is because
Children.
one second, because I may harm my heritage, is because he was married, and bringing another wife into the home is a recipe for disaster. So that's why he doesn't want to do it. I don't remember 100%, but I think I recall that Boaz, the Gemara says Boaz was an alman. Boaz was a widower. So he had a wife, he had children. At that point, he was single. I'm pretty sure the Talmud says that.
Thank you.
Rabbi, did
Rabbi-
we ever hear about the other woman that didn't come with them, the one that
Oh,
decided?
yeah, that's a fascinating story. We don't have time to get into it, but later on, a few generations later, everyone knows probably the most famous showdown in the ancient Israel between David and Goliath. So the Goliath is a descendant of Arpah. Remember, there's two sons-in-law, there's two sisters-in-law. There's Arpah and Ruth. And the generations later, the showdown between Goliath and David is really a showdown between the descendants of Arpah and Ruth. So there's a lot of symbolism there. But that's what the prophets, that's what the Bible says, and that's what the Talmud elaborates. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I was thinking that when she knew, because she didn't want to go because there was no future, but as soon as Ruth marries Boaz, things change. So if she hears the story, she will go for her piece.
That's the irony. The irony is that that's true about Arpah, but it's irony also about the closer relative. The closer relative says, I don't want to marry Ruth because I'm worried about my reputation. Okay? Now, what is left of his reputation? Nothing. We don't even know his name, right? Had he married Ruth, had he kept the legacy of that family alive, then he would be in the lineage that produced the kings, right? So it's interesting that because he puts his own self-interest first, people say, I've got my own self-interest. Ultimately, that's the irony of the story. Ultimately, sometimes by being selfless, that's actually in the long run, that actually gets you your goals, right? What's more selfish, to be selfless or to be selfish? Sometimes when you're selfless, ultimately in the long run, you gain. I'm not saying that's why you do it, but I'm just saying that that's the irony of history, that ultimately people have one interest in the mind, and they're not always the best predictors of what will get them to their ultimate goals.
Rabbi, who were some of the other intervening descendants before David?
So the good news is that the end of the book tells you the exact lineage, all the way from Judah, all the way down to David. Judah gave birth to Peretz to Chetzron Ram to Aminadav to Nachshon. So Nachshon ben Aminadav is a famous one. He's the one who jumped into the sea, was the leader of the tribe of Judah. According to the tradition, he jumped into the sea, the first one to go into the sea before the sea split. Then you have Salma. Salma gave birth to Boaz. Boaz and Ruth give birth to Oved, Jesse, Yishai, and Yishai to David.
Thank you.
I only know this because it's written explicitly. I wasn't there. Okay, let's talk about the names, Rachel and Leah. A lot going on here. Okay, Rachel and Leah. Why Rachel and Leah? We have four patriarchs. We have Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Why Rachel and Leah? So there's different points. One point is that Rachel and Leah the marriage of, in other words, Rachel and Leah were the two that built up were two of the patriarchs that built up the family of Israel. Now, with Rachel and Leah, there was a very powerful element of kindness in the story, because according to the tradition, Jacob wanted to marry Leah. That's the story, and he was tricked into marrying Rachel. So you may know the Medrash, the famous Medrash. The Medrash says, how do you trick somebody in the morning? The verse says that behold, in the morning, and he realized it was Rachel, which means at night he didn't know it was Rachel. So how could you trick him? Even though they're sisters, they maybe look alike, but it's at night. There's no light. But how is it that Rachel did not? How is it that Jacob didn't realize that he's marrying Leah, not Rachel? So the famous Medrash says that Jacob gave simanim. He gave signs. He gave signs to Rachel. He figured his father-in-law may trick him. So he gave her signs, and he says that at the marriage ceremony, you produce these signs, whatever it is, whatever the code word was, and I'll know that it is you. And then Rachel saw that Leah is being taken to the marriage, and the whole town was there. The verse says they invited the whole town. So Rachel did not want her sister to be embarrassed. So she gave the signs to Leah. And that's why Jacob thinks that he's marrying Leah. And that is the reason that he marries Leah. And ultimately, that's the reason why we can have all the 12 tribes. So some people say, what are the people evoking? They're evoking specifically Rachel and Leah because they want to highlight the kindness of Rachel, which allows the house of Israel to be built. Similarly here, when they're talking about both Ruth and Boaz, because both of them display tremendous amount of kindness. Ruth, for sure, by coming all this way and marrying and agreeing to marry this old man. By the way, there's a tradition that he died the next day. That's a tradition. He died after he married her. There's some opinions. The bottom line is they didn't have a long marriage, obviously. He was an old man. But the point of the matter is that we consider that to be a great kindness of Ruth. And also Boaz marrying Ruth, despite the fact that it wasn't popular and people thought that it was not the right thing, that's also a kindness, and therefore we evoke the kindness of Rachel. That's one opinion. Other approaches are as follows. Other approaches are that, what is Rachel and Leah? We discussed this a little bit yesterday. Rachel and Leah ultimately become the divide between the tribes of Israel. The tribes of Israel divide based on allegiance to the sons of Rachel and the sons of Leah. And ultimately, the house of David, the kingdom of David, for a short period of time, just for David and Solomon, that both those families were fully united, right? Because we know after Solomon passed away, the kingdom splits. You have 10 tribes. The northern tribes follow the descendants of Leah, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah and Benjamin, well, Judah was from the sons of Leah, and Ephraim led the northern kingdom, and Ephraim was the descendant of Joseph, who's the descendant of Rachel. So in other words, when you say Rachel and Leah, according to the first opinion, it talks about, wow, the Rachel's kindness. According to the second opinion, we're evoking the tension between Rachel and Leah. But then the verse says, may God make your house like Rachel and Leah. And the verse continues and says, let me find the verse, both of whom built up the house of Israel. So the verse says Rachel and Leah, and that says Shnehem, both of them together, meaning to say highlighting the unity between Rachel and Leah. And that's a blessing that the descendant of this marriage will produce the king who will unite all the tribes, unite the sons of both Rachel and Leah, as we discussed yesterday, that David moving his capital city from Hebron to Jerusalem is really a form of uniting Rachel and Leah, because he moves his capital from Hebron, territory of Judah, sons of Leah, to the border of Judah and Benjamin is the son of Rachel. So that's the form of unity. Okay. Now we have another problem. Another approach. Another approach is what they are doing is they are mentioning all the illicit marriages in the history. If you think about it, Rachel and Leah is illicit. Why is it illicit? Two sisters. in the Torah, even when polygamy was permitted in the Torah and the Bible, polygamy is permitted, but you're not allowed to marry two sisters. The reason for that is because when you create two sisters, when you marry two people, then the Hebrew word is a tzara. You know, in Yiddish, you say tzara is problems. If you marry two wives, each one is called a tzara to the next. By definition, there's going to be infighting, and by definition, there's going to be tension. So the Torah says sometimes polygamy it's not ideal, but sometimes it's permitted. Someone doesn't have children or other reasons, so polygamy is sometimes permitted, but never polygamy between two sisters, because what you're doing is you're taking a natural love that exists between sisters and you're transforming that to tension and to difficulty, so that you're not allowed to do. So Rachel and Leah is an illegitimate marriage. In other words, after the giving of the Torah, that marriage would not be allowed. Judah, birth of Peretz, he says, may your house be like a house of Peretz. The house of Peretz came from an unholy union. This is a union between Judah and his daughter-in-law, which may have been something okay had they known, but in Judah's, because he has to marry his daughter-in-law, and he was supposed to, but in Judah's mind, Judah is with the harlots. So this cannot be too holy. So what we're doing is we're showing that the Jewish people, what the family is saying, even though you're doing something that maybe in the popular mind may be borderline holy, borderline problematic, because he's marrying a Moabite woman. And again, according to the popular opinion, Moabite women, you weren't allowed to marry a Moabite convert. Nevertheless, he says, may this union produce what Rachel and Leah and the union of Judah and Tamar, which was considered to be, which basically established the house of Israel. So the house of Israel is established by unholy unions. Why is that? Very strange. Why is that? So we quote the Arizal. The Arizal says as follows. Arizal was the first, I don't know the first, but one of the early Kabbalists in the early 16th century Kabbalists, he expounds about the concept of reincarnation and how souls are interconnected, and souls come from previous incarnations, and how it's related to their current life, etc., etc. So the Arizal says something fascinating. He says, sometimes there's a soul that's very holy, and because it's holy, the forces of impurity resist its descending into this world. Because there has to be a balance in this world. There has to be a balance between holiness and unholiness. Because if there's no balance, if holiness is obvious to everybody, that's the right path to go. If holiness overpowers the unholiness, then there's no free choice. So there always has to be a balance. Says the Arizal that therefore the forces of unholiness are not going to allow some of the most holiest souls to descend into this earth. Because it's going to tip the scale. It's not going to be fair in the balance, keep the balance of holiness and unholiness. So the only time the forces of unholiness sort of allow for the soul to descend is if they feel that the union producing this soul coming into this world is somehow problematic. So they assume if the union is problematic, then the environment that the child grows up in will be unholy. And then this tremendous soul with all this potential will be in the service of unholiness. And then they agree. So what do you see? You see that the most powerful souls, sort of, you have to trick the forces of unholiness to allow them to come into this earth. And therefore you see that King David and ultimately the Messiah, ultimately Mashiach, who's going to redeem the world, they come from the union of Tamar and Peretz, which was, at least in some problematic, is an understatement. And then also Ruth and Boaz, which even though objectively it was a holy union and a proper union and a kind union, but not so in the popular opinion, there was still some opinions that said that it was not legitimate. So that's interesting about the fact that they are mentioning Rachel and Leah and Boaz as opposed to anybody else. Now, what's fascinating here is, it's already, I'm just going to do another few minutes because we're going overtime already. The verse continues and she says, Boaz, verse 13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. He was intimate with her and the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son, right? Nowhere in the Torah does it say the Lord gave her conception. It says she conceived. The Lord gave her conception implies that it was almost unusual, unnatural, and some people say that's because of Boaz's age. But in any case, she gets a son. Now, as soon as she gives birth to a son, Ruth is out of the picture, Boaz is out of the picture. They're off. Who's back on the scene? Naomi. We talk about how Naomi was accepted by her neighbors. Let's read the verses. Verse 14. And the woman said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who did not deprive you of a redeemer today, and may his name be famous in Israel. May he be to you a restorer of life and to sustain your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you bore him, and she is better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and placed him in her bosom, and she became his nurse. And the woman neighbors gave him a name, saying, his son has been born to Naomi, to the grandmother, not to Ruth, right? The son has been born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then we have the lineage. What happens here is this verse started with Naomi's family. And Naomi's family, she feels that God rejected her, right? When she comes back to Beit Lechem, and the people say, is this Naomi? She says, don't call me Naomi, which means sweet. Call me bitter, because God made my circumstances bitter. And the end of the story is that who was redeemed? Ultimately, Naomi was redeemed. So in other words, of course, Ruth is part of the story, and Ruth is a central figure of the story, but ultimately we're trying to show how the entire family's name was preserved because of the kindness of both Boaz and, of course, Ruth. So I want to make one more point, and then that will be it for today. Oh, a few points. Who names the child Oved? By the way, Oved means to serve. Rashi says, the Malbim says, commentaries explain, his name is Oved because he serves God. Okay, who names children in the Bible? Does anybody know? Almost always it's the mother. Occasionally it's the father. This is the only time in the Bible where who gave the name? The shchenot, the neighbors. You have a child, you say neighbors, hey, what should we name the kid? It doesn't even say what the mother and father named, doesn't matter. The neighbors name the child. Why are the neighbors naming the child? So I don't know the answer, but one theory that I read is because they sensed that this is not a child of this individual people of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz only, but this child is going to restore the kingship, in other words, establish the monarchy within Israel. In other words, he is a child of the community. He's not a child of an individual person. And that's possibly also why Ruth and Boaz are off the scene. The second she gives birth, we don't hear about her anymore. We hear about Naomi because Naomi represents the family. And we sense that this child holds more than just being an individual child of an individual marriage, but this child was seen by the parents, by the grandmother, and by the neighbors, and by the community as the child who's going to restore the lineage of Peretz and of Judah and establish the monarchy for Israel, ultimately establish the Messiah for the entire world. And ultimately they realized that they sensed that this child has the potential to not be an individual person, but to be a person who will serve the community. And that's why we talk about how the neighbors named her, because they all viewed him as a child of the community.
Rabbi,
This is a powerful. Let me just conclude here, because somebody mentioned about why do we read the book on Shavuot. Many communities read it publicly at the reading of the Torah. Chabad does not. We say it at the Tikkun when we study Torah on the night before, the first night of Shavuot. There are many reasons given. In short, some people say we read it because that's the season of the story, is the story of the season of the harvest, and Shavuot is the season of the harvest. So we want to remind the people about doing the mitzvot of the harvest. Others say that we want to talk about Ruth becoming a convert. And really, Sinai is a story of conversion. Ruth accepted the Torah, and we too accepted the Torah at Sinai, and actually we accept the Torah at Sinai every year. So in some sense, we are all like Ruth every year when it comes to the giving of the Torah. Others say that it's to commemorate David because David's passed away on Shavuot. So we want to highlight David's lineage, not just lineage for the sake of just knowing where the person's from, But it's not just lineage, it's the story of David's own personality, that David comes from a union that was all surrounded with kindness and personal sacrifice and sacrificing for the self for the sake of somebody else. And ultimately, that's the calling of the monarch, and ultimately, that's the calling of the Mashiach. Mashiach comes when people learn to put the needs of the others ahead of their own needs, and that's another reason why we read it on Shavuot. So either because it's to remind us of the mitzvot of the season, or it's because to remind us to be like Ruth and accept the Torah, or to think about King David and the Messiah, which are the ones which the kindness of Ruth and Boaz produces. So that's the story in short. If anybody wants to comment, that would be wonderful.
I do.
Use one short programming. Tomorrow we'll do a class. There's no parsha. We'll do a class on Shavuot, 10 o'clock. I'll send out an email. Maybe 9:45, which is our common time. And thank you for joining. This has been a lot of fun for me. Thank you so much. Jill, go ahead, please.
Rabbi, the naming of Oved by the community